When giving advice on the horror film, Alfred Hitchcock once said to torture the women. As such a key character in the history of filmmaking, specifically within the horror genre, one can imagine just how much of an influence such advice has had on the genre as it has developed. This idea of torturing the women has been perpetuated throughout the horror canon, so much so that images of the virginal final girl and the punishment of the assertive sexual female have become synonymous with the genre. However, Barbara Creed theorises the existence of women within the genre beyond such binaries, as they possess the ability to become active female characters and become the monstrous feminine. Creed categorises the examples of the monstrous feminine as the archaic mother, the monstrous womb, the witch, the vampire, and the possessed woman. Two such examples of these monstrous females can be found in Anna Lily Amirpour's A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night and John Fawcett's Ginger Snaps, both of which fall under Creed's analyses of the female vampire. Both films reveal the ability of the monstrous feminine to evoke fear and horror, while also enabling the reclamation of the typically male-constructed genre of horror to reveal the empowering capacity of the monstrous feminine. Creed posits that the fear associated with the female vampire stems from its associations with the abject as menstrual monster and its ability to challenge patriarchal orders as lesbian vampire. Looking to the two films with this in mind, we see the different ways in which this can be interpreted for the purposes of horror. Julia Kristeva categorises the abject as that which does not respect borders, positions, rules, the in-between, the ambiguous, the killer who claims he is a saviour. Both Amirpour's Unnamed Girl and Fawcett's Ginger fall under this categorisation of the abject. However, they do so in very different ways. Firstly, looking to A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, we are offered a monstrous feminine whose only physical sign of monstrosity and abjection comes in the form of her two retractable fangs, which remain unseen for most of the film. Therefore, we are presented with a monster who, in most instances, resembles the ordinary female. However, as Creed points out, woman has been represented within patriarchal discourses as more abject than man, because of her associations with menstruation. With this in mind, the female vampire has been associated with the abject, as discourse surrounding the monster have aligned her with the transformative process of female puberty, as they undergo the unusual change from a state of passivity to one of activity. Though we do not see Girl's menstrual-like transformation to her vampiric reawakening, Aviva Briefel states that menstruation can exist as a metaphorical condition in the horror film, which in the case of the vampire can be viewed in their cursed routine need to feed on blood. As Girl undergoes the rituals of femininity, donning makeup and new clothing, it can be read that she is experiencing the menstrual metamorphosis to womanhood, and thus abjection. Pairing this pre-existing abjection of the menstruating woman with her vengeful acts of violence against men, the girl is placed on the side of the abject, and thus, despite her outward physical alignment with the natural, she is rendered monstrous. While A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night chooses to use the menstrual monster in a more metaphorical sense, John Fawcett's Ginger Snaps as werewolf provides a much more literal approach. Through Fawcett's monstrous feminine Ginger, menstruation is presented as a precursor or even a prerequisite to their committing acts of violence. Through Ginger's metamorphosis, the process of pubescent transformation is demonized and rendered abject as she embodies the abject ambiguity between human and non-human. Notably tracking her cyclic transformation with the use of a menstrual calendar, the monstrous actions of Ginger are symbiotically tied to the abject notion of menstruation. Crafting the monstrosity of the monstrous feminine in this way reflects the fears of the curse that is puberty from both a male and female perspective. The horror for a male audience in the menstrual monster can be seen to reflect the fear and lack of understanding of this process, which suddenly and mysteriously commands the body of every adolescent girl. On the other hand, a female audience would derive fear from the harrowing transformative experience where woman is betrayed by her body, unable finally to preserve her own flesh from contamination by the abject. The other way in which Creed categorises the female vampire is as the lesbian vampire. I would propose that the lesbian vampire can refer to close female bonds that exist beyond the world of men and sometimes in defiance of it. Creed states that the lesbian vampire is monstrous as she threatens to undermine the formal and highly symbolic relations of men and women essential to the continuation of patriarchal society, something we see reflected in the relationships between our monsters, the girl and Ginger, with both Atty and Bridget.
بیشعورا و پولدارا تنها کسی که فکر میکنه یک چیزی باید عوض شه.
Throughout the film, the girl and Atty are aware that they reside in a world in which the men hold a position of power. However, through this awareness, the girl is able to use her position of apparent weakness to break from this order. By punishing those who wrong Atty and thus enforce the patriarchal system, the girl embodies that which makes the lesbian vampire monstrous. This idea that in turning to each other, women triumph over and destroy men themselves. Similarly, in Ginger Snaps, despite being siblings, the relationship between Ginger and Bridget is underlined with queer undertones, specifically in this scene here, in which Ginger's werewolf transformation can be likened to an orgasm. Throughout the film, the girls' relationship is continuously challenged by the interventions of the men around them. However, in the end, the two of them remain together until Ginger's death. Ginger's lycanthropic transformation throughout the film is of note, as she dons typically masculine attributes, from an overgrowth of hair to a phallic tail. By taking on a masculine role, Ginger reflects the use of the lesbian vampire to express a fundamental male fear that woman bonding will exclude men and threaten male supremacy, and thus feeds into Freudian castration anxieties as explored by Creed. Throughout both films, there are recurrent images of both physical and emotional castration. From the girl's dismemberment of Saeed's phallic finger to her overpowering penetrative act of biting and killing Hossein, and from Ginger's dominant sexual position to Jason's menstrual-like bleeding. These images, among others, depict these monstrous females in a position of power over the men around her, thus expressing that what makes the monstrous feminine monstrous is not, as Freud would suggest, her own mutilation, but the power to mutilate and transform the vulnerable male. In the case of the girl, not only does she physically overpower and thus castrate her victims, but she also holds a position of authority in Bad City. Quashing the future integrated patriarchy within the young boy, she essentially castrates the potential toxic masculinity ingrained in the patriarchy of Bad City. As an audience, we can also view her position in her relationship with Arash as a symbolic castration, for the choice to physically castrate Arash lies in her hands, and unbeknownst to him, he holds no authority in the relationship, and thus can be seen to be castrated of his masculine position of power. Dealt with in a similar way in Ginger Snaps, we once again see the monstrosity of this monstrous feminine as a reflection of male anxieties, specifically through Jason. While Ginger's transformation would seem to masculinize her, when Jason is turned, his metamorphosis can be likened to female puberty. From the moment he bleeds through his phallus, he has been castrated, and while Ginger grows a phallic-like tail, he has been stripped of his masculinity. Expressing the height of male anxieties, Ginger's domineering position allows a role reversal between men and women, and thus shows that, as Creed states, the monstrous feminine is terrifying not because she is castrated, but because she castrates. Aware of the tropes of the genre, Ginger aptly states that
no one ever thinks chicks do shit like this. Trust me, a girl can only be a slut, a bitch, tease, or the virgin next door.
However, as evidenced by these films, the monstrous feminine can be used to mobilize and subvert these tropes. The monstrous feminine in most cases reflects male fears and anxieties. However, they do not reflect the fears of a monster, but of a dominant woman of agency and assertion. Therefore, from a female perspective, the image of the monstrous feminine is not one of horror, but of empowerment. Both these films take pleasure in playing with the tropes of the genre. The girl would seem to outwardly express the same attributes of the victimized final girl. Even the film's title would point to the vulnerability of a lone woman at night. However, aware of these tropes, Amirpour's monster uses her seeming vulnerability to her advantage. Once she has lured her prey into a false sense of security, she strikes. Amirpour's monster blurs the lines between what is monstrous and what is not, for the predatory men of Saeed and Hossein also fall under the categorization of the monstrous. Therefore, as the girl bursts in to kill the monster in true final girl fashion, she becomes both feared monster and praised final girl. Following her transformation, Fawcett's Ginger embraces female sexuality. Rather than becoming the victim for this, she is the active monster, unbothered by the gaze of others. While her death in the film's close could be read as the ultimate punishment for her transgression, as Cohen's second thesis on the monster states, the monster always escapes, and thus the monster always returns. Though Ginger is dead, she has passed on her curse to Bridget, who will continue to subvert the norms of femininity in her place. In passing on her curse, Bridget has become both final girl and monster, much like the girl. By containing both the final girl and the monster within the one body, the films offer a more complex view of femininity than seen in horror films past. At the beginning of her writing, Creed states that the purpose of the monster is to bring about an encounter between this symbolic order and that which threatens its stability. However, with the scales of such an order tipping heavily in the male direction, I would argue that there is little stability there in the first place. Therefore, the monstrous feminine allows the exposure of such instability with the goal of reaching a level of equilibrium. The diversion from strict binaries of female representation in both these monstrous females reflects the ever-evolving nature of women in film and society as a whole, which will continue to transform like the girl and Ginger, until one day she is not monstrous nor feminine, but simply human.